And thanks for joining us for another rousing screencast. For those joining us in Tallahassee, Florida, or those joining us at home, thanks for being with us. All right, as we discussed in last night's screencast, you'll see the effect with Korea, and the fact that we have a North and South Korea is a byproduct of the Cold War, as North Korea today continues to be communistic, whereas South Korea today continues to remain democratic. So you can see that just in basic geography, as that will be a major issue. Even if you look at China today, to some extent, you still see some remnants of communism still affecting the country. So, following the Korean War, that will continue on through Eisenhower's presidency, we will deal with that today. I think this is a very interesting political cartoon. I mean, if you think about like an iceberg, right, you can see the top half of it, and those are the obvious sort of countries that are communistic, from North Korea, East Germany, which is part of the Eastern Bloc, Hungary, Poland, China, right? Also notice that they're somewhat hidden from the iceberg, but also, you know, think like the Titanic, right? Icebergs can be several hundreds of feet below the surface and can do damage to a ship. Similar in this respect, that the U.S. is heading for that iceberg right here, that there are people inside the United States who are going to try to subvert democracy and bring in communism, and that's going to bring about the second Red Scare. Of course, the first Red Scare being from what time period? Right, so right after World War I, we see that happening. The first Red Scare is not as big as the second large scare, because if you think about the Cold War period, we're talking about at least 40 years. So fear of communism is certainly going to come inward. You have the Soviet control of Eastern Europe, you have communist China, Korea, and again, it's that fear that communism is going to come to the United States. So a lot of hysteria. Even President Truman at this point is going to order a government employee loyalty program where if you worked for the government, you would be investigated. That you had to show that you were 100% American, 100% loyal to the United States. And anything less than that, you could be removed from your position. What the criteria would be for that, I mean, it could be anything. It could be just, well, he looked nervous. Well, if you're being interrogated by, let's say, the CIA, obviously you might be a little nervous. Another committee that's going to come about is called HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee. And their whole idea was they were investigating anything that seemed communistic or anything anti-United States within the country. For example, Hollywood will be investigated for leaning communistic. You have certainly you're going to have investigations there as well. So certainly, you know, this hysteria is going to be spreading around the United States. There's even, you know, if you were communistic, some people were, you would be banned from teaching at any university. So basically, if you're communist, it was like the Scarlet Letter. You're almost being banished from participating in society. So HUAC does a lot in terms of trying to investigate it and continues the hysteria. Now, by 1947, the National Security Act is going to come about, and it's in terms of trying to modernize the military and intelligence. So you have everything from the Department of War now being called the Department of Defense. It's going to be more centralized. You're also going to have the National Security Council, which is supposed to coordinate foreign policy overseas in an attempt to rid out communism. In addition, it creates the CIA, which operates overseas. It's very secret. I'm sure you're familiar with what the CIA does. So all that is a byproduct of the Cold War. Without the Cold War, this would not have come about. So you see a lot of agencies here. Even the Joint Chiefs of Staff are going to be part of this. The Pentagon, as you see here, all very much indicative of the Cold War. And again, the fear of heading for that red iceberg is very, very real. This is an interesting political cartoon. If you're being sort of interrogated by the Committee on Un-American Activities, notice sort of the idea that if you were exercising your First Amendment rights, you would be tied up metaphorically and, you know, be forced to say what they want. Not like to the extent that we see with torture, But the idea is like we're not going to leave you alone until you admit to what you were doing, even if you weren't doing what they are accusing you of doing. So again, this is breeding a lot of hysteria, and also it's going to breed false information. But again, you're operating the Cold War context. You have certainly the atomic bomb that was used, and that was fearful on both sides of it being used against one another. So by 1952, Truman is no longer president, and Eisenhower, who is actually, he doesn't consider himself affiliated with any political party. He actually chooses to run with the Republicans because they had not been elected in over 20 years. He's an unmilitary general, unpolitical politician, and one of the things that he's going to promise is going to be ending the Korean War with an armistice, and that, of course, is going to happen in about a year later. What is interesting about this election is remember where Democrats had sort of their strong base. Anyone recall? Where did Democrats have a really strong base in the 1950s and 40s and 30s and 20s? Think about the New Deal coalition. Who was part of that? Right. You had the South, for example. You'll notice that the South is not entirely unified for Stevenson, who will run for the Democrats. So Eisenhower actually breaks through that, and you're going to see a shift as where Democrats are located. So, for example, today we affiliate the South with being more Republican. Now in the 1950s, that's going to change it toward Republicans. Prior to that, it was all Democratic. So you're going to have what's called a realignment of political parties here. But Eisenhower will become the president. Now, as we read today, certainly the Cold War and the involvement of the United States is going to take place in overseas in countries you wouldn't necessarily expect today. We looked at Arbenz, who's going to try to overthrow Guatemala's democratically elected president. Again, the United Fruit Company, which was a U.S. company operating in Guatemala, was kicked out. Their land is redistributed to the peasants. And for the United States, that's indicative of communism. We want to contain communism. It cannot spread to the Western Hemisphere. So what do? Train an army to overthrow it. And we just put Guatemala into a period of a 40-year civil war. I mean, just think about those consequences right there. And then, of course, the CIA is going to do something very similar in Iran, where after, again, another democratically elected prime minister, Mossadegh, is going to be elected in 1953. Notice only about a year apart here. And he's going to be overthrown. And the consequences of that is that the Iranians are going to overthrow the Shah, who was put in place, as it was known in Iran, who was very Western, like the United States. That's going to be overthrown. And as a result of that, we have the Iran that we know today, which is very fundamentalist, anti-United States. It's similar to the law of unintended consequences, that you put somebody here, you're going to breed resentment in Iran. And a lot of Iranian dissent toward the United States is a product of the Cold War. So the United States is going to be very instrumental in overthrowing these two democratically elected politicians. So similarities, both democratically elected. We're getting rid of a democracy in favor of dictators in many cases, which almost seems un-American if you think about it. But communism was such a threat in the minds of U.S. politicians that it was better to have a anti-communist person who's a dictator than having a democracy with a communist in power. So that's sort of the idea. Both were done after the nationalization or redistribution of properties for major American companies, both in Iran as well as in Guatemala, and both were seen as potential targets for the spread of communism. Again, the whole idea of containment: contain the communism, contain the bleeding. And here you see Guatemala, Arbenz, and the CIA-backed Shah here, who will be in power in Iran until he is later overthrown. And that's when Iran becomes much more of a fundamentalist country, and you get leaders like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who are just very nutty. Okay, any questions? Any questions, Katie? Emily? Miss Horn?